Alright, so part 4. So what does all this mean? Well, as we choose our shots, we want to vary those shots. This example here from the Charlton Comics How to Draw Comics pamphlet from a few years back. Um, it's quirky, it's dated, but it's cute and it's effective, much like the Wallywood 22 panel example I gave you a couple weeks ago. It shows you different examples. The one with the eyes would be actually an extreme close-up, not just a close-up. The hand holding the glass, that is indeed a close-up. A bust shot or a medium shot. Silhouette, panoramic shot, open shot at the bottom. What that means is there's no panel border, so that is just an open panel. And that can work when the other panels have borders. Flashback, a lot of different ways to handle flashbacks. You can do a jagged line. You can do it in a different color scheme. You can leave it in its pencil form, but there's a lot of different ways to handle a flashback. So here's an example from the How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way by Stan Lee and John Buscema. The one on the left, perfectly acceptable. We've got J. Jonah Jameson on the phone. He's yelling at somebody. I think it's kind of interesting that while he's on the phone, there's no base to the phone, so he's just on a cordless handset at an era when there were no cordless handsets, but regardless, let's not get caught up in that kind of thing. But the one on the left is a little bit generic. He's just sitting, he's angry, but we get it across. The one on the right, it's a different camera angle, and it's a much more powerful shot. He's really getting into it. So by just changing the camera angle and the body language, we make it a much more interesting composition. So you could consider this first draft, second draft as you're trying to figure out your shots. Next one. Here's a sequence of a character giving orders to an underling. Now, it's a simple 6-panel layout, but when you look at it, again, like that Superman versus the Adolf Hitler that I showed you earlier, it's a little bit on the generic side. There are too many medium shots, too many just standing around shots. In panel 2, he's pointing off panel, which is nice. In panel 4, he's pounding his hand with his fist, also a nice bit of body language. But again, consider this first draft, and how would you push it to make it better? Well, I'd argue this is better. In this one, panel 1, the character is now leaning in towards the other character, making him more imposing. The character pointing, better staging here, so we've now pushed the character back, pulled the character towards us. Overall there are some really good choices, but let me show you the two together because it might be easier to figure out. So when we compare them, we can see that the choices on the right are stronger than the choices on the left, even though on the left it's perfectly acceptable. It's a well-drawn page, but it's not dynamic enough. And in Stan's words, if you want to work for Marvel, you need to be able to think the way the artist handled it on the right. And I'd argue that that goes for just about any company. You don't want it to ever get boring. You want to make sure that it's dynamic, that it's exciting, that there's motion and movement, and that you're considering the camera angles. Now, one thing I will say about these is there's not a lot of room here for dialogue. So keep that in mind as you're drawing your pages. You want to make sure your word balloons are going to fit. You can't squeeze them in there. I actually take the effort of lettering a page before I pencil it so that I know who has to say what in what panel and there's enough room. I'm never caught running out of room. But going through this one, if you look at the one on the right, as I said, character leaning in with the cigar up. It's subtle, but it's much more effective. Pointing off screen, the character now staged further off, much more effective. Panel 3, camera from above, looking down, almost the same shot, really, the same expression, same body language, but again, it is more effective. Panel 4, just the bending of the knees and the character leaning in when he pounds his hand. The other character's more casual response in terms of his body language also makes it more interesting. Panel 5, character lighting a cigar. Other character kind of turning away. We know he's leaning against the desk, so he would be slightly shorter. And then the last panel on the right. Now that one works only because we've seen the cigar repeatedly. If you did that and we'd never seen the cigar, we wouldn't know who this is or what's going on. It's also worth noting that the character also was given a striped shirt, and we have the stripes on the sleeve. So they wanted to make sure you understood that's the same character. Now, how do you get there? Well, you get there by doing what's called thumbnails. Now, this is an example of a thumbnail sheet that is done for an actual comic, and you can see the drawings are small, they're not detailed, but the panel sizes are chosen and the positioning of the characters are chosen. So this is worked out before you draw the page. So before you get to this stage, you do this. And this, doing the thumbnail, is not an option, it is essential. Without a thumbnail, your page is never going to be as good as if you use a thumbnail. Now, this is an example of my thumbnail sheets. They don't have to be as fancy as these on sheets of designated paper. But when you look at the detail in my thumbnails, there's not a lot of detail there. In fact, I'd argue for most people looking at this, you can't tell what the heck you're looking at. But that's okay. It matters that I can tell what I'm looking at. And if you notice, there's some notes over to the left. I leave not only note areas, but I write notes in. You can see there's notes here: poster, nose-up, mooring. I also indicate the page numbers. In this note over here, it says Gypsy needs a hat. So I would assume in one of these panels here, I think it's for page 5, I'm sorry, page 4, Gypsy needs a hat, must be this hat here. And the reason for the notes, sometimes I draw the thumbnails months or even years before I actually draw the page. So having the thumbnails with notes is a great way to remind me of what it is I wanted to get across. But you want to essentially figure out your page sizes, your panel sizes, and how they relate to each other, what shots you're going to choose for each particular panel. From there, you take the thumbnail and you blow it up. So if you look, this thumbnail is this thumbnail here, blown up, and then the page is completed. I blow it up into 11 by 17 sheet of layout paper, and then I lightbox it and I work from there. Add the lettering, etc., etc. So you can see when you compare the thumbnail to the finished piece, they're pretty close. So I stayed pretty much the way I wanted to stay on this particular page. Not always the case, but 9 times out of 10. Here's an example of Bob McLeod's step that he adds in between thumbnails and pages. He actually blows up his thumbnails, but then he takes them to what he calls a layout stage, and that's this. The layout stage is a loose representation, but more detail than his thumbnails, and then you can see the final. It's a lot cleaner, and he accomplishes this by not only blowing up his thumbnails onto a full-size sheet of paper where he draws kind of light and kind of loose here, he then lightboxes it again onto Bristol, and this time keeping the pencil extremely clean. Now you could say, well, that means I draw this thing 3 or 4 times, and I would argue that if you're someone who's messy, you can see all the smudges here in Bob's work, and we have very few smudges. There's a couple here, but if you like working clean, Lightbox is your friend. And you then take from this stage, then you would ink it. All right, but that's an example of Bob's process. Here's another pencil page. I believe this is by Kevin Nolan, and you can see how clean and how much detail's in there. There's a good amount of detail, but it's not over-rendered. A lot of these are still just shapes. The tables back here, still kind of shapes, and you see the lettering's in place. So putting the lettering in before he draws it really helps him as well. An example of Gene Colan's pencils. Gene Colan worked in an almost halftone manner, really getting a lot of shading and textures in his panels. Makes him really hard to ink, but that's the way that he works. That's an example of a Gene Colan pencil. And this is Dustin Nguyen. He works very clean. You can see in his buildings, not a lot of detail there. He saves that for the inking stage. So this is the level of detail he puts in his pencils. In fact, this here, which is going to be all solid black, he doesn't even fill it in black yet. He just leaves it as a line. Another example of pencil work. The thing to understand here is I just really want you to get the sense of the level of detail in pencils. So it's there, there's enough to ink, but not everything is all colored in. Like, for example, in this, if you work at this level of blacks and grays, you're going to find your pages are getting really messy. If you work in this level, you're saving the blacks and the heavy shadowed areas, and in this case, the artist indicates it by little X's. X's mean fill this in black, fill this in black. That's a way to work in a cleaner state, right? So that can be really helpful. From there, this is an example of using blue line pencil and then regular pencil. So you can see the blue line being figured out here. There's the shade, the lampshade, the bedpost. You can see the actual one he moved over a little bit. The door, and you can see in this case there's the doorknob, and it's a different doorknob than what he went with. But using blue pencil is a effective way of keeping your pages clean, because when you send these into a plate printer, the blue lines won't show up. Now, if you use blue line pencil, and they call them new non-repro photo blue, if you use these pencils and you're doing this work yourself, you're going to find that when you scan the page, the blue lines are actually going to show up. And there's a trick to getting rid of those, and we'll get into that as we get further into illustration. But blue line pencil is a nice way if you're somebody that likes to lay out things messy and then you don't want to bother with the light box. You draw the regular pencil over the blue line. A couple things to think about too with pencils. A lot of people don't realize this. The lead that you use, if you use a softer lead, which would be in the B family, you're going to get a darker line, but you're also going to get a softer line, and that smudges easy. If you use an H pencil, you're going to get a sharper line, but it's going to be hard to get dark, and it's going to be nearly impossible to erase. I generally lay out my pages in 2B, and I finish the page in an HB. I also use a .03 pencil lead, which is a very thin pencil, so I can get really fine details in there. Right. I also want to show you this. This is an example of Steve Rude's Steve Rude's thumbnails. And you can see he does them in marker so that he can not only do the panel layouts and elements on the panel, the way characters are positioned, he can also spot in the blacks, which is a nice way to make sure your page balances out. So even at this small size, these are really tiny, you can see that there's good black areas that will draw your eye in. Okay? All right, more in a minute.